Over the past year, I've started being contacted by more and more companies who want me to test out their gear and make videos on it. And I turn most of these down because I have very strict requirements myself. I don't want to have words put in my mouth or to have someone have oversight over what I make. I make these videos largely for fun at the end of the day. So that's why I've turned down so many, but I have started getting a few sort of inquiries that I am actually interested in. And we're going to start with this, the TTArtisan 500mm f6.3. An entirely manual focus, entirely manual lens. It doesn't even have electrical contacts. But I think it's actually really interesting. So we're going to take a look at it today. We're going to see what it's good for and whether it's a good beginner's lens for wildlife photography, because this is very affordable, around £400 here in the UK. So a quick disclaimer before we begin, TTArtisan sent me this for free. They don't want it back. Now this is quite common with companies in China in particular, because once you count the shipping costs and everything of both directions, it's not worth it to them to receive it back. I don't usually like accepting things for free because it makes it hard to claim to be impartial, and you should be cautious if somebody has received something for free and they're claiming to review it. I don't call these reviews for that reason. Just bear that in mind going forwards. It's hard to claim to be impartial. I can stand here and say, oh, you can trust me though, I'm very trustworthy. This hasn't affected my opinion of it, but who knows, it may well have done. So just bear that in mind. But you can totally trust me, honest. So physically, I think this is quite an interesting lens. It feels very much like it was designed for videographers. The metal focus and aperture rings seem to indicate that. They look like they were used or designed for use with focus pulling systems. But the aperture ring itself is also completely clickless. That again would kind of indicate that it's not totally usable by hand. It's just something to keep in mind. It has a very stiff set of focus and aperture rings, but that's kind of nice for manual photography because it allows you to more easily keep things in focus. It's got a very long focus throw as well, which again helps with that. You're not really going to be shooting action with it, so I think it's very viable for that. Just something to keep in mind. It definitely seems to be designed with video in mind. And if you are an aspiring wildlife videographer, then I think this lens is a very compelling option. Yes, it's not weather sealed, but you're getting very good optical quality, surprisingly good optical quality in my opinion. I was very impressed with this lens. For a very reasonable price, it's a great way of getting into this discipline when it comes to video. I think it's a very good option. This lens does come with a little lens hood, and it's a sort of a screw-on metal affair. Rather nice, and it actually means that the lens cap still fits over the end of it, because the lens cap itself is also like a metal cap. This is very loud. It's quite a nice little setup, so I've got nothing to complain about there. It stays on really well, and I generally really like the machining of this lens. It is rather nicely made, to be honest. It's quite a simple construction, but there's a lot to be said for that, and it certainly seems to have been put together well, at least for the short amount of time that I've used it. Longer term usage, I'll have to update you in the future. Okay, quick durability update. I rubbed some of the paint off of the barrel. I don't really know how this happened, but I do know it happened inside my camera bag on my way home. Nothing had been rubbed off during the day when I was actually leaning it on windowsills and on fences and things, so I'm fairly certain this is my fault. I don't know what rubbed up against it. Maybe the paint could do with being a bit more durable on future revisions of this, but this is more of a confession than anything else, and yeah, I'm sorry TTArtisan, I had it for one day and I managed to do this to it. One thing I would say when shooting this lens is that if you're shooting manually and you're going to try and get things in focus, f6.3 is a challenge when you're using a telephoto lens, because the actual in-focus plane is extremely thin. So I would recommend shooting in a burst and moving your focus from before your subject to after, and you'll hopefully get something in focus that way. That's a useful technique when shooting a lens like this. Something to keep in mind if you do pick one of these up.
In terms of the optical performance of this lens, I think it's perfectly decent. It's not the sharpest thing in the world, but I would use it, and I think it's got a sweet spot somewhere around f8 to f11. When it comes to chromatic aberrations, I think it performs reasonably well. I have seen other people suffering from some purple fringing, but that wasn't my experience. I think it's roughly equivalent to using my Nikon 180-600 with a teleconverter attached, which is something I have complained about in terms of its aberrations, but that is a £2,000 to £2,500 setup. This is a budget lens, and therefore I think it's performing reasonably well. But a high point for this lens is its bokeh, the blur in the out of focus regions. I think it's actually very nice.
Now, this lens is certainly going to be of interest to people on lower budgets because it is very affordable and you can work around the limitations of it. But there is another use case for this as well, and that is to stick it on a film camera, because it's available in practically every mount in existence, which is very interesting. And so when TTArtisan approached me, I asked if they could send me the F-mount version. I can stick it on an adapter on the Z9, but I can also mount it to F-mount film cameras, and this is a very interesting option. I'm curious to see how the photos come out. The main downside is it's not super bright at f6.3, which is a bit of a problem these days because the fastest colour film stock is 800. It's not ideal, but I still have a few shots left on a roll of Portra 800 in this camera, so I'm going to finish that first. We'll see if any of those come out in focus, hopefully, or exposed correctly, and then I'm going to chuck some faster black and white film in, and we'll try that as well. Hopefully we get something kind of interesting. I think this is quite a compelling use case for this lens. I think it's good for video on modern cameras. I think it is a viable budget option for a lot of people, but also this is kind of interesting. Let's go and see what I can get. Don't hold your breath.
So my conclusion for this lens for film photography is that I really like the colours and the sharpness and the in and out of focus transition in particular. These portrait shots came out lovely. I'm really happy with them. But the experience itself was difficult. I shot about 20 photos and only 3 came out in focus. This is mostly down to the lack of electrical contacts in the lens. This means that the lens can't allow you to focus at a brighter aperture and then stop down to your chosen aperture when firing the shutter. This causes problems with split image focusing screens in particular. I'm not too sure how it will play with other types of focusing screens. If you do know, please let me know down in the comments.
Now, one thing to keep in mind with this lens, and often with a lot of cheaper lenses, is that they don't tend to have optical stabilizers, and that is the case here. So you're relying on the IBIS in your camera. With a longer focal length like this, that is quite challenging. Now, you have to enter the focal length into the camera, and it will adjust for that in the IBIS, and it's okay, but as you can see from these video clips, it's a little bit wobbly. You can adjust this later if you're filming things. You can stabilize it further in DaVinci Resolve, for example, but it is something to keep in mind. You probably want to shoot it on a tripod, which I would be doing if I hadn't taken the tripod foot off of the lens and left it at home. The reason I took it off is because I usually carry a longer lens by the tripod foot, and this one very specifically said on it, on a sticker, don't do that. So I took it off to prevent myself from forgetting and breaking my camera. Something to keep in mind, you can't carry it by the foot, but it is quite lightweight and it's very comfortable to shoot like this. It is just going to be quite challenging on cameras that don't have the world's best inbuilt stabilization. Maybe something like a monopod or a tripod would be a better bet. For video, you're probably going to be on tripod anyway.
The tripod foot is rather functional too. It has Arca Swiss grooves, which is really nice to see. It's a little bit sharp to hold, but as they do tell you not to carry it by it, I don't really see that as being a problem. In this clip you can see that I've had to use an additional plate to fit it in this tripod head. That's not a fault of the foot, that's a fault of this tripod head. I tested this on the Peak Design travel tripod and I had no trouble with it staying secure.
So what are my final thoughts on the TTArtisan 500 6.3? Well, if you're a beginner to wildlife photography and you're looking for a cheap lens, I would recommend spending a little bit more, because doing it with manual focus is going to be very challenging and it's going to occupy a lot of your learning time. Something like a Sigma 150-600 Contemporary would be a better option. However, if you are a videographer and you are looking for a prime lens for doing some wildlife videography, but you don't want to spend too much money, well, this is a very interesting option. I'd recommend checking it out because it's very well suited to that task. You can rig it up with all your follow focus sorts of things if you fancy it. It's a very viable option. So I'd be really interested to know if you have used it for that and if you've got one of those sorts of setups. I'm a less experienced videographer than I am a photographer, so let me know your thoughts on that down below. Now, when it comes to film photography, it's quite challenging. I have absolutely no idea what those photos are coming out like. It does work at f8. I could just about get things in focus, I think, but at this point you know better than I do whether any of the film photos came out in focus. Let me know your thoughts down below. I'd be really interested in hearing them, and ask me any questions if you have any about this lens, because I still have it and I can have a look and see what I can figure out for you if there's something you want to know. If you aren't subscribed to this channel, you can do that if you wish. It would be much appreciated. But thank you very much for watching anyway, and check out some of these other videos that I'll put up on the screen, and I'll see you next time.